Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubnanda, and welcome back. I believe it is Marvel Episode 7 today, and we're going to be talking about Captain America 3, Civil War. Now, this is a very special movie. For many, and, spoiler alert, for me, it's probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite, MCU movie that isn't Thor Ragnarok. Obviously, Thor Ragnarok is a masterpiece. There's just something about this movie. There's a message of unity, but also ongoing sort of discourse over the famous Benjamin Franklin quote. I'm butchering the quote. I'm going to paraphrase it. Something to do with giving up freedom for security. But this idea, this concept, this notion of the balance, the very fine line of balance between security and freedom, it's something that rings true today, but it also, has been a very important issue for a long time. What comes to mind is the Patriot Act, but what comes to mind for now in sort of a more contemporary way would be the relation of this sort of notion of security and freedom with a more sort of less security in terms of how do I say this? Confrontation and, defense, but more security in terms of public health. There's an issue of freedoms over each other's safety that we're not doing too well on in America right now. It's the virus is still real. People are still out there protesting against wearing masks. It's the point being, it's a very universal issue that deserves tackling on every front. And I think this, while it isn't necessarily directly associated with everything that's going on, I think the underlying message and the themes and the conflict between these two ideas explored in this movie are something that, is very important through all time. But without further ado, let's get into Captain America Civil War. So this movie opens in 2016, right? And 2016 was sort of like a battle year in terms of, there were battle movies with the superhero universes. Captain America Civil War, obviously, as well as Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice. But also off-screen, there was a battle between the DC and Marvel fans. One of the greatest benefits of the internet is that it allows everyone to sort of connect and talk about their enthusiasm for various sort of niche elements of pop culture. Not to say that the Marvel movies are niche by any sort of means, but that sort of ease and ability to communicate your opinions, and the finding of community in these very large volumes of opinion sometimes, it leads to a phenomenon of tribalism. It also breeds troll culture, and this sort of division and the frenzy of competition made these fan bases sort of toxic in this year. These are the same types of people that boycotted movies like the all-female Ghostbusters of 2016. They chose to find any fault with the film rather than face the fact that they just didn't like it because it was a movie featuring a predominantly female cast. There's people that find any opportunity to do what they can to praise the DC extended universe at the expense of the very successful and very fundamentally better Marvel Cinematic Universe, because you can't be a fan of both. You have to be a fan of one or the other. It's the same thing with the Star Wars movies. Fans angrily sort of rebelled against Star Wars after The Last Jedi failed to meet their extraordinary expectations. They also boycott movies like Captain Marvel because Brie Larson asked for more diversity in blockbuster films, and they wanted a remake of Game of Thrones because they didn't like the last season. Okay, I know. Now that I think about it, I'm one of those people. I get very passionate about Game of Thrones. I didn't enjoy the last season. I think that one's... I guess it's a little understandable. It's reasonable. But certain themes in these toxic fandoms emerge all the time. There's a hatred of diversity, a hatred of women. There's a bunch of entitlement. There's a ridiculous idea that new installments of a series can diminish previous installments. That makes no sense to me. 2016, it was the year that everyone established sort of how bad pop culture fandom had become. And obviously, being one of the biggest companies in the world and one of the most prolific creators of media that's permeated all of our lives is Disney. So Disney was often at the storm of this negativity. They knew how to make blockbusters, and they were dominant. And while most of their successes sort of came from their animated features, success has been sort of ingrained in Disney for a really long time. But live-action Disney films, they were a bit less reliable. But Disney combated that by making some very important acquisitions. They bought Marvel Entertainment in 2009. They started distributing all of MCU's films. They then also bought Lucasfilm and Star Wars. They released the new Star Wars trilogy. And out of the top 10 highest earning films of the year 2016, 5 were distributed by Disney. There's a reason Disney now owns about 34% of the big Hollywood studio market. They're the biggest company in media. At least, entertainment. It's they're massive. The size is it's incomprehensible. 2015 finished with a Disney film at the top, and the top 2 films every year have been Disney films since 2016. They know how to do it. Disney knows how to do it. And, they've been doing it because 2016 to 2019 is a pretty consistent run. It's an unprecedented level of success. Obviously, it's going to breed, ill talkers. There's problematic implications, obviously, of Disney's dominance, especially after the acquisition of 20th Century Fox. But it's not that's not the focus of the toxic fandoms that we were talking about. Toxic fans go after Disney with wild conspiracy theories. They claim that Disney's success is because of bribing film critics or, sort of intimidating them even to review them favorably. It's just likely that films distributed by Disney are well-made movies that sort of hit the mark because they know what they're doing and they've been doing it for so long. Toxic fans go after Disney's sort of agenda to introduce diversity. I don't know. I don't think it's an agenda. Their movies have been overwhelmingly about straight white men, and it's nice to have a little bit of more interesting storytelling than something we've been doing as a collective around the world for so long. It's all. It's just. There's a very weird culture with the fandom, and all of this was a preamble to Captain America Civil War. And it was a reflection of the time it was released. It was the starting point of the increasing divisions. It's not just toxic fandoms as well, it's now deepened into a very large, very apparent divide in America's fabric as a society. This is the age in which Captain America Civil War was released, and that's what it's about. The movie is about, ostensibly heroes fighting each other over an ideological dispute, with, obviously like a provocateur in the background. But it's a friend-on-friend conflict, so there's no easy resolution that can be reached. So, in that way, this is a reflection of this fan culture and the division. It was supposed to be scheduled to be released at the same day as Batman vs. Superman. Two hero versus hero conflicts facing off against each other. I think that's pretty meta. But, you go beyond that and you realize that Civil War is a success. As, the highest grossing movie of 2016, it demonstrates this dominance of Disney. And it goes even further beyond that, because it sets the tone for Phase 3 of the MCU, which is even bigger. The 13th film in the MCU at this point is, I guess, the first in this series to, really require previous viewings to really enjoy it. You have to watch a few movies before you can watch this one to really understand what you mean, what's going on. Civil War has 12 superheroes, and they all have various motivations and actions. And all of these threads sort of weave together this beautiful plot. But it's a lot, and, a lot of it is made with the assumptions that the viewers know what they're, watching because they've seen the movies that come before this. But, if you think about it, I don't think Marvel would have gone for this type of risk unless they had Disney behind them. This is a pretty big risk to hinge a new blockbuster on maybe the 8 movies that have come before it. It's pretty impressive, Civil War directors, they deconstruct and challenge these tropes of the superhero genre, the Russo brothers, the same way they did with Winter Soldier. They address this criticism of the blockbusters of the time that they sort of climax with these really destructive battles. As we spoke about in Ant-Man last episode, Civil War, it also deals with the consequences of these climaxes. Going further from the discourse that began in Age of Ultron. It's got a shadowy villain with a more psychological threat than an actual physical one. And his sort of criminal deeds are that he exploits the insecurities of heroes and faces them with their truths. Ultimately, it makes him one of the most low-key villains, but also the most successful, because I think he wins. There's a climactic brawl of a dozen heroes that has to happen, but it happens at the end of the second act rather than in the middle of the third. And it's one of the greatest spectacles ever seen at this point, because it gives way to an unexpected and much more significant emotional climax.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Subversion of expectations is, I guess, a phrase that I'm probably going to use a bit, because that's what made this possible and sort of made 12 movies over 8 years that, all hit the mark, more or less. The MCU always puts characters above else, and I think that's probably why they have yet to miss the mark. And Civil War is like the creme de la creme of this, because it's sort of the precursor to what was to come, obviously, with Infinity War and Endgame, but it's the first sort of culmination of this expansive universe rather than a very small one like we've sort of seen with the first two Avengers movies. It's simultaneously a finale and a premiere for both Phase 2 and Phase 3. They've broken down what we expect from superhero movies and just continued to uphold Marvel's reputation of never being safe. They don't make easy narrative choices to maintain success. They keep trying, they keep experimenting. And in that way, Civil War exemplifies the best qualities of the Marvel Studios, because without a doubt, that narrative risk-taking, it wouldn't be possible without the safety net of Disney and their continued success. It goes hand in hand. Marvel added to Disney's success just because Disney's success obviously allows Marvel to take more risks. And Captain America Civil War, that's the culmination of it at this point. So the movie, it takes its title and a lot of very important beats from the comics and the comic book crossover event Civil War. This premiered in 2006 and lasted up until maybe 2007. And at this time, the events of Civil War, they played out in every single Marvel comic book storyline. They were written by Mark Millar and drawn by Steve McNiven. And in the story, this team of young and inexperienced superheroes attack a group of very powerful supervillains, and it causes the deaths of hundreds of innocent people in a small Pennsylvania town. And this starts a sort of growing sentiment in the US that superheroes need to be accountable and held accountable for their actions, requiring them to sort of register, train, and operate as law enforcement agents, or just retire from crime fighting. And that goes and splits the community right in the middle. Tony Stark and Iron Man, Tony Stark, who is Iron Man, he is all for the pro-registration. He wants to implement it because he thinks it's inevitable, and he wants to do it responsibly and sort of cut his losses and do whatever he can to control whatever is left. Steve Rogers and Captain America, who is Steve Rogers, he's against the registration. He thinks that it puts superheroes at risk. I apologize. He thinks it puts superheroes at risk and forces them to act as political puppets. It's easy here to realize that the central conflict is an ideological one. There's a debate over freedom versus security, and it's not a villain or like a world-ending threat that comic books would usually sort of go by. Ultimately, I think it's the most human story. In the comics, Steve surrenders because of all the damage that their conflict causes and is eventually assassinated. And that ties into the Winter Soldier comics that we discussed in the last Captain America episode. Now, this comic book series was a huge cultural success and sales success for Marvel. It had really important plot points, and its impact was reported in mainstream news outlets at the time. The success of Civil War, it encouraged a lot of comic book collectors to start sort of taking modern comics a little bit more seriously, because there was a sense of decline for a bit. So this movie sees Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, who wrote Captain America the First Avenger, Thor the Dark World, Captain America Winter Soldier, come back. They started writing late 2013, and after impressive screenings of The Winter Soldier in 2014, Anthony and Joe Russo were hired again to direct the next Captain America, which is Civil War. Originally, the movie was intentioned to carry on the plot threads of The Winter Soldier, be a more conventional sequel. Other MCU heroes were added sort of like adversaries in an adaptation of the Mad Bomb storyline, where a villain creates this device that makes people turn against Cap. Kevin Feige suggested that the filmmakers adapt Civil War instead, which made the film much more interesting, I'm not going to lie. It's a departure from that formula that, heroes are supposed to fight artificial and very contrived evil. It's nice to see a character-based, character-driven, ideological debate take place in an airport in Berlin. Very violent debate. Eventually, Robert Downey Jr. signed on to the film, and it was realized that the movie would sort of put focus on the relationship between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, sort of put a main point on their growth as characters over 12 movies and sort of their personal conflicts that will always arise. There's a history with the characters, and the choice of source material made it far more complex than any other superhero movie that would have come out in that year even. A large cast of the previously introduced heroes was called in, and this movie became bigger than any Avengers film. It was nicknamed Avengers 2.5 actually. And it also includes 2 new and very significant additions, setting up the future of the MCU. So Black Panther, the most significant POC superhero. He represents a character with his own agenda and is not affected by either Tony or Steve's ideologies or histories. And then there's Spider-Man, the representation of the new generation. He idolizes all of these established characters and doesn't really fit in. And he's dragged into this conflict that he really doesn't understand. Now, Spider-Man has been one of the most popular characters for Marvel, but obviously with the rights issue, as everyone knows, Sony holds the rights, and that prevented his inclusion in the MCU. But in November 2014, there was a hack of Sony's files, and it revealed that they had discussed sharing the film rights with Marvel Studios. This happened because in 2014, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was just completely fumbled, and they figured Marvel Studios could apply their formula and their approach to reinvigorate Spider-Man into what he's supposed to be. Eventually, Marvel and Sony reached an unprecedented deal. Sony's and Marvel decided to split the rights. Spider-Man would appear in Marvel's team-up movies as well as solo-produced Sony films. Black Panther and Spider-Man, they were the future of MCU. Unfortunately, we lost Chadwick Boseman very recently. And it's a devastating loss. Just as a person, Chadwick Boseman was so inspirational. And what he meant and what he stood for should really be remembered and honored. But they were introduced in this movie to support Civil War's huge character drama between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers. So in The Winter Soldier, we've established now that Bucky, the best friend of Steve Rogers, survived his death and has been brainwashed by Hydra to be an assassin. He's reprogrammed in between missions and placed into cryogenic freezing to maintain his age. In that film, obviously, Hydra is destroyed and Bucky is freed, but Civil War opens in 1991. Before the fall of Hydra. So Bucky is awakened. He's prepared in the Hydra facility for his mission. Then we cut to a forest road where we see a car and he runs it off, gets blue pouches from the tree trunk. The people in the car aren't shown at this point. We obviously think they're unimportant. But the scene is shown in detail 2 other times in the film. But in the beginning, it achieves these 2 things. First, we notice that Bucky is going to be a prominent part of this movie, and it's going to be mainly focused on Steve Rogers. It doesn't matter how many other heroes show up in this film; it's his movie. It's also a continuation of The Winter Soldier. But the second, it establishes the blue pouches, and their representation begins this huge subversive misdirect that plays out very, very interestingly in the 3rd act. For now, they're a mystery. We get the Marvel logo, and then we shift to the Avengers in a present-day mission in Lagos, Nigeria. It begins with Wanda, who's Scarlet Witch, played by Elizabeth Olsen. One of the newer MCU superheroes, having just joined after the events of Age of Ultron, is being coached through surveillance by more experienced Avengers, Steve Rogers and Black Widow, while Falcon watches from the rooftops. Now, they want to prevent the theft of a biological weapon from this lab by Rumlow, who was a Hydra henchman. He showed up again from the Winter Soldier. It's a sequence for these 4 Avengers sort of working in a unit, and it shows them use their incredible strength and teamwork to stop Rumlow and his team. Steve Rogers emerges as the clear leader. He fights through the henchmen. Sam flies around. Wanda uses her powers, and Natasha uses hers. Hers being the best assassin of all time. There's incredible stunts and practical effects on display here. It's a spectacular sequence. There's a demonstration that the Russo brothers know exactly what clear, visceral action they want in this movie. But the mission ends when Romulo tries to kill Steve in this suicide explosion.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Wanda's able to contain the explosion, but her telekinesis can't last for too long, and she sort of sends it up and damages a building, causing a lot of people to die. There's a disastrous fallout. Now, Wanda's one of the most inexperienced but the most powerful Avengers, and she's caused the deaths of quite a few innocent people, including humanitarian workers from the nation of Wakanda. Now, it calls into their question a validity of this sort of independent group of very powerful individuals making their own rules and fighting throughout the world, like the comics. These sentiments are delivered by Thaddeus Ross, who comes back from his role in The Incredible Hulk in a completely different context, like completely different. There's a compliment here to the action of the Avengers, but it also calls out their irresponsible behavior. But it also makes sense that Thaddeus Ross shows up here because, the Hulk is gone. He compliments the actions of the Avengers, right? But he shows the footage of the destruction caused in Manhattan after the Avengers, in DC after the climax of The Winter Soldier, in Sokovia after the climax of Age of Ultron, and now Lagos. Now, most blockbuster films end with no real sort of comment on the destruction that would have occurred in the events of the film. And Civil War is a movie about consequences. And it starts with the consequences of these climaxes. It didn't come out of nowhere, this approach. There was a moratorium on citywide destruction in blockbuster films for years after 9/11, but at a certain point, filmmakers started doing the destruction again. And then, obviously advances in visual effects allowed for really creative ways of destruction, and destruction porn became a big point in film criticism. Now, Civil War allows Marvel to address this criticism. So Thaddeus Ross, he reveals that 117 countries in the United Nations have ratified the Sokovia Accords that say that the Avengers must have international oversight. Now, if anyone refuses, they either retire or face prosecution. And there follows a discussion. Rhodey and Vision are logical about the need to sign the accords and the need to sort of include the global concern about their actions. They convince Natasha, but Sam is against it. And then there's Steve and Tony. They take opposite sides in the debate, beginning the sort of central conflict of this film. Their arguments are organically developed out of, combined performances in films together over 8 years, and sort of culmination that gives the rest of the film that emotional resonance for longtime MCU fans. This movie is really for the fans. It's really rewarding people who go out and support every Marvel movie there is. So Steve, he begins as a patriot in Captain America in the Second World War before getting frozen in the ice for 70 years. He continues his fight in the present day with the Avengers, and then the Winter Soldier finds him getting sort of weary of being a soldier. He feels out of place in the modern world, and he wants to stop fighting. And once he discovers that Hydra has infiltrated the U.S. And the power structure, his patriotism and his dogma is completely shaken, and he sees this sort of disillusionment with modern politics. In Age of Ultron, Steve sort of resigns himself to this life of a soldier, but only within the context of the Avengers, which he can largely control. Now, the Accords, they mean sort of international and political oversight, which he distrusts due to his disillusionment with government structures. And, it also means that he loses control of the Avengers that have kept him in the fight. You also add to that, there's the death of Peggy Carter, whose death reminds him of the life he missed after the war. And he decides it might be the perfect time to retire. So Steve decides not to sign the Accords just so he can get out. Now, Tony has never handled the consequences of these superheroics as well as Steve. Because Steve is a lifetime soldier. He doesn't celebrate the destruction in battle, but he accepts it as sort of inevitability. It has to be minimized, but it can't be avoided. Collateral damage. But Tony's not a soldier. And his experiences as Iron Man haunt him. That's what Iron Man 3 is all about. It explores that PTSD from the events of the Avengers. In Age of Ultron, he develops an AI to proactively defend the world because of that fear. Obviously, that AI becomes psychopathic and tries to destroy all life. But, it's that same fear. In his first scene in this movie, he uses his barf technology, which is referenced in a future movie, to relive and sort of correct his behavior the last time he saw his parents, right before they died in a car accident. We also learn that Pepper has left him and that he's in a completely emotionally fragile state due to his unresolved PTSD, guilt, and now his recent breakup. He wants a way to get rid of this guilt. Another sort of straw and he could be over the edge. And eventually he's confronted by Miriam, who blames Tony for the death of her son, who was an American student killed in Sokovia. Miriam is played by Alfre Woodard, and she's searing, powerful in this one scene. She calls Tony out for causing collateral damage and death, and when the Sokovia Accords do the same thing, Tony has to be the one to lead the charge to sign them. There's an emotional stake based on the guilt that requires him almost to fix his mistakes. There's very sharp writing, so it allows the first-time viewers to sort of understand Steve and Tony's positions, and the performances by Evans and Downey are excellent as per usual. At this point, these actors are so comfortable in these roles because they've been doing it for so long. It just feels natural and effortless. But there's an emotional weight to the choices that they make in this movie that become clear after watching these characters grow and change through the past films. Steve Rogers begins again as the ultimate patriot, and Civil War makes him this rebel. Tony Stark pretty much spat in the face of the Senate in Iron Man 2 and now has become the figurehead for political oversight. Tony used to act completely out of self-interest, but now he's all about being selfless and something about serving for the collective good. And Steve used to be purely selfless, but now he wants independence and sort of a desire to find normalcy. And these are fundamental character shifts that happen gradually over time with many films, all the way up to Endgame. Steve and Tony are the dual protagonists of the MCU between phases 1 to 3, and their arcs lead them sort of trade places at the end of the 22 films. Civil War is where they trade places. It's that sort of midpoint, almost. It's fascinating to watch, and it's just another remarkable storytelling achievement from those who continue to redefine what we know as storytelling, the MCU. Eventually, the Sokovia Accords pushed Tony to be more responsible and Steve to retire, but Civil War can't just end there. That would be a short movie. So, a very major wrinkle arises. So, the Sokovia Accords are presented by King T'Chaka of Wakanda in a UN meeting in Vienna. A car bomb detonates and T'Chaka is killed, and surveillance footage indicates that Bucky is the culprit. So this launches a worldwide manhunt for Bucky, as well as a mission for T'Chaka's son and the new king of Wakanda, T'Challa, played by Chadwick Boseman. Bucky is the only connection Steve has to his old life, so he has to protect him. That's the only way that he can still stay involved. But he doesn't sign the Accords. So by chasing and pursuing Bucky as Captain America, he is committing an act of crime. Steve decides to act selfishly. He wants to protect his old family from his new family. And Sam helps him. They eventually find Bucky in Bucharest, but have to fight T'Challa as Black Panther to get him. There's a strong action direction from the Russos in the sequence. There's an inventive fight in the stairwell, foot chase, highway tunnel. The action doesn't fail to disappoint. It also showcases Black Panther for the first time. It's exciting because he becomes immensely popular right after this. Rhodey stops the fight. He arrests Steve, Sam, and Bucky and T'Challa. They're taken to a UN facility where Tony appeals to Steve again to sign the Accords. Bucky's cell is infiltrated by Zemo, the villain of this film, played crushingly by Daniel Bruhl. I'll talk a bit more about him later. But he uses this old Hydra notebook to activate Bucky's brainwashing that cause him to fight his way out of custody. It's fun because, there's an opportunity to see Tony, Steve, Natasha, Sam, T'Challa all fight Bucky out of costume. And there's a sort of fresh flavor in the fact that they're fighting in street clothes. Steve and Bucky escape, and they question why Zemo might have targeted him. So Bucky reveals that there were 5 more super assassins trained at the facility that he emerged from in Siberia, and Zemo probably wants to activate all of them. These superheroes are linked to the blue pouches that Bucky received in the opening part of the film, and Steve realizes the danger of 5 more brainwashed assassins under the control of Zemo, and decides to go to Siberia. But obviously he has to recruit a team first. Tony anticipates this, and he anticipates another confrontation with Steve, so he recruits his own team. And this sets up 2 of the greatest moments in the MCU. At this point, it's made clear that Tony's been keeping tabs on superheroes, and Spider-Man, who's been operating in Queens for the last 6 months, has piqued his interest. So Peter Parker is 16 years old, played by Tom Holland. He returns to his apartment, finding Tony chatting up Aunt May, Marissa Tomei, before a more private conversation in Pete's bedroom. Tom Holland is incredible as Peter Parker, and the chemistry that him and Robert Downey Jr. share, honestly, it's beautiful. There is an introduction of Spider-Man in Civil War. It allows the MCU very smartly to not retell the overdone origin story, especially because it would be the 3rd time in 15 years. So, it's smart. They understand that we probably understand the character. But Tony's talk with Peter also convinces him and the audience of Peter's potential. And it begins this relationship that plays out over Tom Holland's 5 movie appearances with the Avengers so far. With Marvel so far, sorry. Tony offers to upgrade Peter's suit to help him in exchange for his help against Steve. And it's a fun, sort of two-hander between Holland and Downey Jr. There's a lot of levity, and but it still continues the character focus of the film. Obviously, the next fight is the iconic airport fight. It was named the splash page by the filmmakers because of its nature. It's this huge visual effects extravaganza, and it's considered to be one of the greatest superhero set pieces filmed at that point. It features 12 superheroes, all with unique powers and personalities, all battling across an airport tarmac. It's inventive, it's clear, visual effects are seamless. There's a 3-act structure within the sequence that makes it meaningful and not too long. Beyond that, the whole sequence is rooted within the characters and the relationships. Like Tony and Steve's character arcs, the sequence, it has a much more deep emotional resonance when you view it as a culmination of the movies that have come before it. So let's bring Daniel Brühl's Zemo in. So the MCU obviously prioritizes development of heroes over villains. Heroes are the people that carry movies from film to film and carry series from film to film. Civil War ends that approach. But it's criticized, like a lot of MCU films, for its forgettable villain. Despite this, however, Zemo is probably the most successful villain in the MCU at this point. He was a Sokovian soldier who lost his entire family to the attack in Sokovia in Age of Ultron. He wants revenge on the Avengers, but obviously he can't do so with physical force because he's not a superhero. He's not a supervillain, at least. He studies Hydra documents that were leaked in The Winter Soldier, and Zemo discovers a very devastating truth that tears the Avengers apart from the inside. He's the one who bombs the UN and frames Bucky so that Bucky will be caught. He also activates Bucky's brainwashing and retrieves the blue pouches. But the pouches and assassins, they're not that important. What's more important is who Bucky killed to get those pouches. And that's Tony's parents. So Zemo brought Tony, Steve, and Bucky to Siberia to reveal this fact. Tony is already emotionally fragile at this point, realizes that his parents were murdered by Bucky, and it pushes him over the edge. For Tony, it's a betrayal that's made even worse because Steve defends Bucky. And Bucky was brainwashed by Hydra. He didn't know what he was doing. So Steve won't let Tony kill him. And that's the ultimate betrayal. Steve and Tony's relationship is just completely done at this point. The Avengers are torn, and Zemo's plan worked.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
The best trick of this movie is the fact that it sets up this huge third act threat, but substitutes it with a emotional slap across the face. It criticizes these blockbusters for ending in a very formulaic, destructive, world-ending way, and it ends with a very intimate and visceral, emotionally charged 3-person fight in an isolated facility. Everyone is hurt. In the end, Tony demands that Steve leaves his shield behind, and because the shield was made by Tony's father, he leaves the shield, and he's no longer Captain America, and he limps away with Bucky. There's no easy resolutions in this film. There's just betrayal. It's the perfect climax to the Civil War, but also to the MCU so far. In the meanwhile, T'Challa confronts Zemo. Zemo expresses his grief. He regrets killing T'Challa's father before he tries to kill himself. T'Challa stops him and sees what vengeance did to Steve, Tony, and Bucky, and decides that he wants real justice for Zemo. Zemo is arrested, but he succeeded. And that's just it. Tony, he returns to the Avengers headquarters to oversee Rhodey's physiotherapy. And Steve reaches out to Tony in a letter. He gets his mistakes, but he doesn't really apologize for keeping the secret. But he offers an olive branch, a cell phone that Tony can use to call Steve if he ever needs help. And at this point, Steve breaks his team out of prison. There was a lot of criticism for ending this with Steve's letter. A lot of people consider it a cop-out to offer this sort of reconciliation chance right after Steve and Tony split. But others go far enough, they think that the movie should have killed off one of the characters at this point. It's a spectrum. It could have gone any way, but I like the way this ends. It's a torn family. It's brothers turned against each other. They have made it impossible to repair the damage, to sort of reassemble the Avengers. And repairing a family is a process that takes a long time. Plus, obviously, there's more Avengers movies coming. Captain America Civil War, it's this incredible achievement in blockbuster filmmaking because it takes 8 years and 12 films and all the relationships between all of these characters to deliver this emotionally resonant but still action-packed superhero movie. It has specific criticisms of the superhero genre. It deconstructs this genre to produce a much more mature version and realizes the potential of this shared cinematic universe and really, really, really goes into the history of it. There's a commitment here with Marvel Studios to bold and challenging blockbuster movies, and they could have made a very easily successful but conventional Captain America movie, but the fact that they did this and tore the Avengers apart right before they were about to face their biggest threat, that's what makes MCU the MCU. And then you have to compare it, obviously, to its direct competitor, Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. Now, both of these films were initially scheduled for a May release, but Warner Brothers eventually moved this movie to 7 weeks before. Both feature two lead characters from their universes fighting each other. Tony and Steve, they're well established, and their motivations from Civil War draw from previous movie appearances. It adds credibility to their conflict, but also an emotional resonance for the viewers because we're invested in this character. But Henry Cavill's Superman was introduced in one movie, and Ben Affleck's Batman shows up for the first time in this movie. So there's no connection to these characters. And even worse, they didn't support the characterization of either Superman or Batman in this movie. That just added to this disconnect. There's an ideological conflict in Civil War that's clearly established, and Tony and Steve react in ways consistent with this development. But Batman and Superman's conflict is contrived by a supervillain that makes no sense, not credible, and is clunky and overstuffed and doesn't really feature both titular characters. It's clunky and overstuffed even though it only features like 3 characters. Civil War is great. It's breezy. It's effortless. It's doesn't superheroes, but it feels natural. There's similarities obviously between these two films, but it just goes to further highlight the flaws of the movie Batman vs. Superman. Like Civil War paid off 8 years and 12 films worth of development, but the second movie in the DCEU rushed to get to this point despite having only one movie before this. But while the DCEU struggled to get off the ground, Civil War earned $408 million in North America, which is a 50% increase in ticket sales from the last Captain America. And obviously this is to do with, the inclusion of so many other MCU characters. It earned $1.2 billion worldwide, making it the highest grossing film of the year. And 4 of Marvel's Phase 3 films follow right after the events of this movie. Marvel was also so impressed by this film that they gave the screenwriters and directors the keys to the kingdom. They hired them to write the next 2 Avengers movies back to back. And in retrospect, you realize that Civil War is sort of an audition for these movies. It's exactly what they wanted from Infinity War and Endgame. Civil War was a movie that continued to expand the cast, pay off of early films, and balance incredible superhero action with important emotional resonance. This successfully launched Phase 3 of the MCU with a more intelligent focus on character approach, with a deconstructionist sort of view on the superhero movie. It set the stage for Marvel after this to keep pushing boundaries, to keep subverting expectations, breaking every box office record. By the end of this phase, many long-established characters leave the series, and new additions became increasingly diverse. There were bold narrative choices, increased diversity, and all of this contributed to Disney's box office dominance. Despite what fans of the toxic sort might argue, Marvel's blockbuster storytelling would not be without the safety net of Disney's pop culture dominance. Toxic fans can argue for safe and unchallenging blockbusters, but then we'd never have movies like Civil War or Thor Ragnarok. And that's why we continue to enjoy the commitment to entertainment that the MCU has. Anyway, that'll be all from me today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to us. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh Nanda, and stay tuned for Marvel Episode 8 coming out next Monday. Alright, take care.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.